Now, John, we were talking about, too, about, say, working when, but there's no stigma in doing an honest day's work, whatever it might be. You mentioned your first job. What was that?
My first job was hoeing corn.
Hoeing corn.
Right. I was hoeing corn for a local farmer in my community. He's dead now. I don't mind calling his name, H.H. Limbley. And I was being paid 5 cents an hour, 10-hour day. And after the first day, he called me aside and said, "You hold as much corn as any grown man." He said, "Tomorrow I'm going to pay you man's wages," which was 7.5 cents an hour. And from then on, every time I was working, I was making man's wages, 7.5 cents an hour, or 10 cents an hour, whatever it happened to be. But that was my first job, hoeing corn.
And the men hoed corn for that.
Right. I followed an old man in Fleetwood, Mr. Charlie Cole, Mr. Coles, all day in the field, and he was a steady worker. And I stayed right on his heels from that morning when we started until that evening when we stopped. And evidently the farmer noticed it, and he was a fair man, about as honest a man as you ever see in your life. So he told me, "You do as much work as a man, I'll pay you man's wages." And
well, were all the people working, were they black or white or mixed together?
mixed. I think maybe at that time I was probably the only black in the field. But my dad had worked for the man many times before. And but I was probably the only black at that time. There was maybe 7 or 8 of us in the field hoeing corn.
Well, now, when you all were working together, there was no thought about anything of who you were. You were all neighbors, so to speak, same community.
You just worked, and you talked a little as you worked, and you rested together, and they bring water, and you get your drink of water, and then you start back to work again. When dinner time came, you go to the house, and they'd tell you when dinner was ready, and we'd sit down and eat, and very shortly go back in the field again. No, there was no problem as far as race or anything of that nature. You were just another individual out working for your living like everyone else. But the farmers have always been a real good lot. I have to give them credit. I can remember one time I measured tobacco in Ashe County, and that was almost unheard of, a black measuring tobacco. And I think they had chosen some specific farm for they thought maybe that I wouldn't be embarrassed or anyone would say anything to me. And of course, when I would go to some of the farms, the farmer would look at me and he'd see that I was black, and he wouldn't tell me no. I had one or two to tell me, "Can you come back?"
Is that right?
And I'd tell him, "Yes, I'll come back." And every time when I'd go back, that farmer would be sitting waiting for me.
Is that right?
They would be sitting waiting for me. And when I'd finish measuring their field, they'd say, "You've done a good job." They're fair-minded. They're pretty honest people. And I think most of the people in Ashe County are basically farmers, and they were just fair and honest persons. I think they taught me some lessons maybe that I had neglected to learn as I was growing up. As such.
We were talking about our ancestors a little while ago. You mentioned you didn't have any children. Now, and living with your grandmother and your grandfather, you probably heard of a lot of maybe them talk about some of the life that they had lived before. Did they ever relate any of the Civil War or the slave tales or anything like that? Did their memories?
I've heard my grandmother talk about slavery just a little bit. Of course, she was born in 1863, and I think the slaves were freed in 1865, so she couldn't have been very old. And some of the things she said probably came from her mother. But her mother was did housework for the family, just like a servant cooking or something of that nature. And I have heard her say that her mother was treated just like one of the family. Now, my grandmother's father, she told me that he was part Indian and that he was pretty hard to control, and that he had received several whippings as a slave.
As a slave.
And of course, again, I guess a lot of this she heard from her mother.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't ever know what happened to my great-grandfather. His name was Jack Miller. He was the one supposedly part Indian, and I don't ever know what happened to him. I always intend to ask my grandmother, but there were certain questions when I was growing up you didn't ask people. You might get your jaws boxed. If they wanted to tell you, they did, and if they didn't want to tell you, you didn't ask.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one of those circumstances.
You knew what to ask, didn't you?
I knew what to ask, or maybe I didn't know what to ask. I don't know which. But a lot of questions that I would like to have known about my ancestors, I don't have answers for them.
No. First, the book that came out, and of course, this television series, Roots.
Right. That made more people interested in their background. Right.
And it must be an enormous job to try to locate.
In the case of many black families, it would be, I would say in the case of most black families, it would probably be almost impossible. You might trace back to the time they were freed as slaves, and then most of the slaves, if I remember correctly, took the names of the families that they worked for. And you couldn't go beyond that. It would be hard to.
Mm-hmm.
And no records, very few records were kept of blacks' births, deaths, back in those days, because at one time I think many blacks were just considered as cattle. Some families kept records of their slaves and birth of other slaves, but it would be very difficult for a black person. I think Alex Haley was just extremely lucky.
Well, he was, in that I believe some of their owners named them and sold them by name, and I guess if they could find the bill of sales, found where maybe thus number were sold, and they could find
trace back there.
Mm-hmm. Trace back, but that would be the only way, wouldn't it?
That would be the only way. The only way.
And
records of that nature would be hard to come by. If they belonged to an individual family, they most likely would not want to depart with them. And then, of course, many of those families years ago, I guess their possessions have been passed on or destroyed or whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
It would be, I can see it would be very hard for a black person to trace his family history back beyond certain points.
I'm sure it would be. It'd be very, very difficult. I think it's hard enough. I said, working in our genealogy department, if I found out if our ancestors would have been a little bit more ornery, been taken into court, there might be some records of them, you know. But it makes it very hard what if you can go with your senses, which is always great, but if you want to add a little spice to it and find where they've either had some sort of brought into the church for church discipline or had to be taken into court, well, there's plenty of information. It makes it much easier.
Stress, yes.
So, as we were saying about Ashe County, it's of course, we need to know how it was in our community, but I'm sure it's not like it was maybe in neighboring Wilkes. I guess they had a population greater.
More blacks, considerably more. I've always been curious to know as to why there were so few blacks in the mountains. Of course, history itself teaches us that the people in the mountainous area had little need for slaves. They were just small individual farms, and most of the things they did themselves. Probably their historical background did not, they were not from slave-owning families, so.
Some of them, I don't suppose, really had much sympathy with, or they had qualms against owning slaves.
Right. but you do find very, very few blacks in the mountainous area. I can remember in college, one of my professors used to make this observation quite frequently. He said, the black that you encountered in college from the western part of the state is an entirely different person than the black from the eastern part of the state. He seemed to draw a very distinct cultural difference. Seemingly, his theory was that the black in the western part of the state more or less adopted the culture of the white more so, and the black in the eastern part of the state seems to have been maybe deprived or alienated from that culture more so. I sometimes think maybe he might have been right, I'm not sure, but he had that philosophy.
Well, I've done, just for what it's worth, I've done interviews, of course, about close to 60-some interviews here with this Oral History Project. Had we not mentioned that you were black, your background that you have experienced working for 10 hours a day for 7.5 cents and 10 cents an hour, plus your family's lifestyle of gathering herbs, that seemed to be the lifestyle of many, the majority of the mountain people here. Seemed to me that the culture, a person who, if we had not injected this into it and had read this, they would not have known that you were of a minority group, because your culture, your lifestyle seems to me to be the same.
Well, I'm strongly of the opinion that people who grew up in the mountainous area or who grew up in the mountains certainly have more points in common than they have more common points that they can agree on than they do differences. The lifestyle didn't maybe vary a great deal. Everyone struggling to make a living as best they could, regardless of race or what they might have been. Religious observances and church services were much the same. In fact, I'm inclined to believe that many blacks patterned their church services after white church services. I think the only differences I have ever noted might have been in some instances, some black churches might get a little more emotional, but I think I can account for that. A lot of blacks back maybe when things were really hard for them, maybe the only bright spot they had to look to was what they thought was heaven or something in the future.
Their relationship with their Creator.
So when they got into their religion or their churches, they become very emotional, clapping, singing, and looking forward to the heaven that some of them pictured as a place where there's golden streets and golden clothes and all of that. So it's been an emotional thing with them, and it still is very much so.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, that's
But there are so many similarities between the two cultures.
Do you recall any discussions about the last hanging we had in Ashe County, which was a black man, Will Banks? Have you heard your folks talk about that?
Yes. Someone in my community had some pictures of Will Banks. At the time he was hanged, I believe, in Ashe County. And I'm not sure, probably my grandmother or some of the older persons in the community might have been there at that event. I've heard them talk of the things that transpired before the trial and then the decision that he was to be hanged. But I can remember seeing a picture, and it's been years ago, and I don't even recall who had it.
I just wondered if the black community felt like that the punishment was extreme for the crime. Of course, I've read a great deal about that situation, and I know the expression or the summation a lot have given it has been that, you know, it was kind of a self-defense thing, each one carrying a gun because they were frightened of the other. But I wondered if the black community felt like that was.
At that time, I'm inclined to believe that if, of course, now that's taken place so long ago until it's hard for me to even inject a think. But if I were to inject my thinking into the line, I think maybe if the community, black community as a whole, thought the penalty was extreme, I don't believe it would have been expressed or stated. I sort of doubt that it would have been expressed or stated. I don't recall ever hearing any old person ever giving an opinion as to whether they thought it was right or wrong.
Tells you
I've
something.
never heard an old person give an opinion as to whether they thought it was right or wrong. I have heard one or two old persons I remember saying they never wanted to see another person hanged. I've heard that statement. But as to whether they thought it was right or wrong, I don't think I've ever heard one express an opinion.
We have had some inquiries concerning that, the particular information that we might have about it. I think someone was doing a book or something on hangings and the last hangings in the county, and we became interested in it somewhat. And I was told, and I want to check this out further, that the sheriff at that time, who was a Witherspoon, refused to hang him, and he resigned in favor of someone else becoming sheriff, who said they would. So I just wondered how much controversy there was about that, and certainly apparently there was none in the community because they did not express themselves.
No, I've never heard any expression at all as to what their opinion might have been. I have heard stories of Will Banks hanging, but it just somehow or another they didn't stick with me. I just don't recall them. I've heard my grandmother tell about it over and over again. I've heard a few older persons, but at the time that I heard them, I was real young, and I guess it really didn't have any significance to me at that time. And then, of course, in later years, when you become interested in those things and would really like to know the facts, the things that happened before the hanging, the old persons are gone, and you don't have their knowledge at your disposal again.
For sure. It's too late then to gather it.
Yes, it is.
Well, I thank you for your contribution to our oral history project by allowing me to tape you, and I think maybe we can remedy that somewhat by getting all the stories that we can and all the information we can of the past, and that is our purpose to do that. So,
well, there's been very little that I could really add to it, but it's been a pleasure
well, thank
chatting
you.
and talking.
Thank you so much.